Hi, I'm Yvonne Pran with Bible 805, and we are now on day number 9 of reading through the book of Matthew, and we are on in Matthew 17 and 18. And first of all, this starts out with a really extraordinary event, the transfiguration of Jesus. What's just happened is Jesus has rebuked Peter and for not believing that he really had to suffer. And then in again, just Jesus really practicing what he preaches, he's showing mercy and kindness. And in spite of his outbursts, he takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain with him. And it says he's transfigured before them. And we really have no concept of what that means, but he shows his glory, what it meant that he was truly God. And Moses and Elijah are there with him. And so much, along with so much that this shows the prophets and the law, they're talking to Jesus about his upcoming death. The voice of the Father comes from heaven and says, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." And Peter gets all flustered and he wants to build little tents for him. And then, he just doesn't know what to do. And they look up and all of a sudden it's just Jesus there alone. And we don't really know why he did that. One of the things that I think is possible is Jesus wanted to give at least these three, he wanted to sort of zoom out and give them the big picture of what he was doing. Moses and Elijah being there, everything that Jesus did was prophesied going back thousands of years, everything that he was going to do and say. And we've talked about how in the book of Matthew, it's really a bridge book between the Old and New Testaments, and Matthew constantly saying, this was talked about in the Old Testament, this is happening now. And the transfiguration is probably the pinnacle of that truth, that everything that Jesus did was prophesied before. And then after they get down from the mountain, they find the disciples are all frustrated because they tried to heal this little boy and they couldn't. And Jesus, of course, just with a word heals him. And they said, "Well, why couldn't we do this?" And he said, "Well, your faith wasn't big enough. And if you have just a little tiny bit of faith, it can heal people. But," and this is the important thing always to remember about faith, it has to be in the right object. It isn't just your faith, it's that it's in Jesus and in his power. Peter gets a fish and pays the temple tax for them. And then as they go along, the disciples, you'd think they'd be learning by now, but they want to know what makes for somebody merely great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus brings a little child along and he said, "This is what you need to be great in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And he goes on and he talks about how the good shepherd goes after the one little sheep that's lost, and how just one person is so important. And it really bothers me in some churches today where they talk about how we have to do this because of numbers. And, we're not going to do, well, I'll tell you one of my pet peeves. We're not going to do bulletins anymore because, they're just too much trouble. And, it's mostly just the older people that want them. Well, the older people are important. If just a few people needed them and that was the only way they could find out what's going on in the church, that might be something to consider. And so often we need to look at who are the least, the littlest, the lost. That's what we need to make our priorities if we want to be servants of Jesus. And then Peter says, "Well, how many times, he knows everybody messes up. Should I forgive my brother when he sins against me? 7 times?" And Jesus says, "No, 70 times 7." Really an absolutely unlimited amount. And he talks about how he tells him the story of a servant whose huge debt was forgiven, and then he wouldn't forgive a fellow servant. And Jesus, oh, that made him very, very angry. And the servant was greatly punished. And he says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from the heart." Forgiveness, total, complete forgiveness, is incredibly important to our forgiving Savior. Let's live like him.